Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
So what if will lead you to alternatives?
Yeah, the logical conclusion of this.
Yeah, I mean, how is it going to play out 10 years into the thing? So it's not really a what if or an alternative.
There is a story in, say, like cows coming into BIC or something like that. I mean, the logical conclusion of not, banning sort of.
Correct. If this goes on, what happens?
That's actually not far-fetched at all, I feel.
From being the preserve of a handful of American and British authors in the late 20th century, science fiction today is a global phenomenon. From Afrofuturism to the popular Chinese science fiction of Liu Cixxin, Hao Jingfeng, and others, writers, editors, and readers around the world are turning to this genre to make sense of our world and our futures. The global character of contemporary science fiction is matched by the profusion of subgenres that have come to inhabit it. Climate fiction, or cli-fi, and hopepunk are just two of the many approaches to science fiction that respond to our present-day conditions. Where and how does English language Indian science fiction fit into this world? A look at some recent works suggests that climate change, political extremism, the legacies of colonialism, and the overwhelming role of technology are some of the themes that have exercised the imagination of Indian science fiction writers. Do these themes run together to create something that is identifiably Indian? Should there be? And how are Indian science fiction writers and readers engaging with contemporary global science fiction? These are some of the questions that a panel consisting of authors Gautam Bhatia, Lavanya Lakshminarayan, columnist T.G. Shenoy, and journalist Shrabonti Bagchi will discuss in this episode of BIC Talks. And now, over to Shrabonti.
So, as you know, we'll be talking about Indian science fiction today. And we have two authors and a prolific chronicler of science fiction, Gautam Shenoy, who's been writing a column and who's been writing several columns on Indian science fiction and science fiction at large over the past several years. To begin with, I want to just start by talking about, how refreshing it is that we are talking about Indian science fiction today at this forum, and how something like this would have been pretty rare even 5-6 years ago. Over the past few years, we have seen more and more authors get published. We have seen anthologies come out. We have seen Indian writers get nominated and win awards, global awards. So what happened in the last 5 or 6 years? Was it sort of one cumulative effect that came into play as writers and people who write about science fiction? Do you want to talk about that?
So when I was growing up, my introduction to science fiction was through this Golden Age volume, hardback. And then in the bookshops, when you'd go, you'd find Isaac Asimov, Arthur Clarke, bit of Ursula Le Guin, bit of Gene Wolfe maybe. And that was it. And in fantasy, of course, you'd have Robert Jordan. After a while, George R.R. Martin and so on. When I came to Bangalore last week, I did my usual bookshop run. And you still find Arthur C. Clarke, Isaac Asimov, all of that. But now you also see, what you see is now, in addition, books published by Indian science fiction writers. Earlier, you just had one lone Samit Basu, waging a lone struggle against a entire bookshelf of writers from the West. In Champaka and in Bookworm, I saw Tashan Mehta's 2017 book, The Liar's Weave, which was perhaps one of the first ones from this the last 5 years. Lavanya's Analog Virtual was in Bookworm. So I think that's changed. And I think it's changed a bit because I think a generation of people who grew up on that science fiction fell in love with it and wanted to become writers, have now, in a sense, come of age and been writing. And I think there is more openness among Indian publishers to perhaps take a bit of a risk and publish outright genre in a way that they weren't open to before. And of course, an openness among readers to think that, okay, it's not just Western writers who write genre.
I would also want you to address how easy or difficult it was for both of you to get your books published. Lavanya's book is also getting published in the UK and US. So how easy or difficult was it?
I mean, I definitely concur with what Gautam was saying. There is a lot more openness in the Indian system to publishing outright genre fiction. All of us growing up, I share a lot of Gautam's experiences in terms of walking into bookstores and only being able to see the Anglophone world represented in terms of people who had a stake in the future. So, if we're talking about science fiction specifically, it's your Arthur C. Clarke, it's Asimov, it's Heinlein. Very rarely anyone from another part of the world, really. And so I think we are in this very lovely moment where we also have the privilege to say that the future belongs to us. And not necessarily just the future, the world of imagination belongs to us, because my book is set in near future Bangalore, but Gautam's book is purely speculative. It is in an imaginative world. And to see Indian publishers being willing to put those books out there and publish them under the gamut of speculative fiction, and specifically science fiction or fantasy, has been really exciting. In terms of getting my book published in India, it was honestly fairly straightforward in a manner that I was not expecting, considering the fact that it has heavy genre elements, a lot of technology, deals with near future disparity. It was a much harder struggle in some ways to get that book across to the United States and to the UK, just because I think that space is opening up. It is not as open as it is right now. Having said that, things worked out fine, for which I'm very grateful.
Things have changed in the last 5 years. It's not that Indians were not writing imaginative fiction earlier. It's just that we've now hit some sort of a critical mass. There's some sort of momentum going. And that's also because the world is sort of opened up. And while I would commend Gautam and his team for putting out such great books in genre, because in India, publishing works a little differently. In the West, for example, and when I say the West, and basically US, UK, these are the two major markets. Like you have genre imprints. You have a Tor or you have an Orbit. Not in India. Not in India. Here, where the same editor is editing a children's book, will edit this thing. And it's the same publisher. So in that, to get it published, I think it's commendable from them, the efforts that they put, and the publishers. And I would also give a lot of credit to our Indian readers as well. Because till the early 2000s, you could say, and I speak as a reader, amongst many of them, there was this whole feeling of sort of ghar ki murgi dal barabar. Because I personally know a lot of people who would say, I don't read Indian authors. But that acceptance has grown even in the readers as well. And that's something that the publishers have sort of picked up on. You look at movies that are happening, almost all of them are sci-fi. I mean, including superhero movies, right?
Brahmastra.
That belongs to a subgenre, separate genre, which I actually call mythsploitation.
I'm going to come to that. That is one of my questions. Do not speak about it right now.
No, you brought it up. You brought it up. So that's where it's happening. And we're lucky that we have people like Indra Das, like Tashan Mehta, like Samit Basu, like Gautam, like Lavanya, whose books are really up to global standards. Not just they're good among Indian books.
Right.
They can rightfully take their place in world SF. Because while they're rooted in India, and that's how I sort of define Indian science fiction, written by Indians, but can take on the best of SF in the world. I mean, there's a reason why Gautam was nominated for the Astounding Best Writer. She's been nominated for Nebula. And these are global awards.
Yeah.
As much as I'm happy that these books are coming out and readers are reading it, I'm also happy to see all of them going neck to neck, head to head at the Nebulas and at the Hugos, which is only going to increase the readership. One thing I would like to say is while they're rooted in India and it's set in Bangalore, there's a certain universality to them, to all these books. And I've heard this from a few Indian authors, and this sentiment has been echoed even in non-Anglophone, like African writers have echoed this sentiment, Southeast Asian authors have echoed this sentiment that, okay, for some publishers, it's not Indian enough. And then for some publishers,
it's too Indian.
It's too Indian. Right? So where do you...
So that's always a difficulty that I think writers of color everywhere sort of face. How to sort of play your culture, how much of your culture to bring in. So actually
Actually, so just one, this reminds me of one really lovely line I read. The magazine I work with, Strange Horizons, was doing a Palestinian special issue. And what one of the people pointed out in their essay was that they want to be a Palestinian who writes about Deep Space Nine, Star Trek, not a Palestinian who wants to write about like Palestine in their science fiction, but they want, just like American science fiction writers can write in universals, so should like non-American science fiction writers, address universal themes.
Absolutely, yeah. We were talking about this earlier as well, right? Like the centering of a story, locating a story in a certain milieu or in a certain culture. For the longest time, it was cool and important things always happened in the US, right? Like aliens always landed in New York. And
While Indians are busy praying in front of Taj Mahal.
Yes,
remember this
Indians are
scene.
always like busy praying in front of the Taj Mahal, of course. And like when an asteroid is about to hit the Earth, it's only like, yeah. I think even Ray was aware of this because in his short story, Bonko Babu Bondu, the alien, which has that whole story about E.T. and everything. Somebody says that why would aliens land here in like this Birbhum or something, whatever? Wouldn't they land in like London or Paris or whatever? That absurdity of that is actually like, for the longest time it was true. So how are you guys breaking that? I mean, when you locate your stories, okay, in Gautam's case, it is an imagined world, but it is culturally is very rooted in the subcontinental sort of culture and milieu. And Lavanya's book, of course, is set in Bangalore. How do you sort of, make that leap of imagination?
Bridging that gap and finding the right balance where you can reflect India without necessarily conforming to what a white post-colonial perspective of what India should be. It is very tricky to navigate that. And in the case of, say, Analog Virtual, which is set in near future Bangalore, I'm talking about a Bangalore that I have witnessed in the last few years, the post-startup revolution Bangalore, which in many ways, very honestly, echoes a lot of technocentric cities around the world. If you look at San Francisco, the ethos, the culture, the forward-lookingness in both its positives and its negatives. Bangalore being a city where you can get anything delivered to your doorstep, often very controversially, in under 10 minutes, right? What is the problem with that? What is the infrastructure, but also how do you problematize that? Because that is a very problematic space to be in. And how is this distributed? Just because a book is set in India, what version of India is it set in? This becomes a huge bone of contention, I feel, especially when representing India to the West, because there is an idealized notion of India as seen in, Independence Day, where people play the Taj Mahal, and then you have your slumdog millionaires of the world, where poverty is glamorized and made to look spectacular. And that is, I'm not going to say that is a blanket expectation, but that is an expectation in a lot of pockets. And to break that association that is all India can be, that has been hard. If you encounter Analog Virtual and you read it, it's not all glorious, right? Just because we are chasing technology and producing technology on an international scale, is that necessarily a good thing? It's a double-edged sword. Who has access to this technology? How does it impact people who don't have access to it? And in the book, the way I choose to reflect that is particularly rooted in India with the types of disparity we see today. I wrote the book before the pandemic, and then when we went into our first lockdown, I was horrified because a lot of the things that the privileged few of us were able to do, like work from home in air conditioning and have door-delivered groceries, we occupied one end of the spectrum, and on the other end of the spectrum, you had migrant workers
on the road,
experiencing horrors we cannot comprehend. And it was terrifying to see that had actually happened. When I wrote the novel, I was talking about tech disparity 25 years in the future, 50 years in the future. But I think the important thing is that is a slice of Bangalore that is as real, the tech privilege side, the tech disparity side, as it is anywhere else in the world. And to be able to represent that has been challenging because I don't think the world as a whole is ready to see it. There are people who are, but I think it's important to represent that it's a possibility.
Yeah, and I think that also lends itself that a certain edge, which kind of actually brings a lot of interestingness to the entire.
In the case of all the books that we mentioned, conforming to what India should be. It's not formulaic. It's written, it's universal, it can be enjoyed by anybody, but it's not written for keeping a Western person's POV in mind.
I like to think of it as India existing in multitudes, which is true. You walk 500 meters in any direction. The version of India before you just changes completely. And all of the books that have been mentioned so far reflect the multitudinous of India in that sense, where it is possible to engage with being Indian and Indian experiences in a whole host of different ways, including in Gautam's book, which, despite being in a secondary world, has influences of India in its language, in its use of the world building. It has parallels to the caste system, the architecture, and yet it is entirely universal. It is accessible, it is understandable. There are oral traditions in his novel. All of this harks back somewhere to the notion of India and what India can be, but at the same time, this is also, it is not fetishized.
For example, Indrapramit Das's Devourers, it's called werewolves. The story starts in the Mughal period and it just comes down. I mean, an Indian werewolf. Many people
Not
think...
really part of the sort of the folklore.
Yeah, so that's one strain. Darshan Mehta's Liar's Weave. It's an alternate India, and astrology forms a big part of it. Lavanya's, that's neo-cyberpunk. Samit Basu's Chosen Spirits, that's again neo-cyberpunk. That's a very immediate 10 years, it could happen next moment kind of a thing. It refers to this protests and all of those things. That's one India. The world of Gautam, Sumer, that's rooted in India, and you can see a version of India in that. Like you're saying, right down to the caste system or the exclusion and the inclusion and the sort of hierarchies and all that thereof. So there are multiple versions of India that you see, and that makes me very happy. Right? Because it doesn't play up to this monolithic idea of India as much as, India's beauty lies in its diversity. We've been taught that since childhood.
You didn't really say that.
Right?
You didn't really use that line. Okay.
No, I did because it's true.
Yeah,
because it's true.
And to chime
right?
in,
As much as we try to reduce it to its, singular elements, shorn of all context,
absolutely.
shorn of culture and shorn of this thing, then we're going to not get anywhere, which is why I like all these versions of...
I think to approach this from a complementary angle, I think one book that does this really well, this sense of being an Indian sort of work of speculative fiction in a global world, is Salman Rushdie's Harun and the Sea of Stories, which is never marketed as genre because, reasons, but it is genre. Like it is a cross between fantasy and science fiction.
Yeah.
And Harun and the Sea of Stories has every trope, every classic trope of, the classic fantasy novels, and also has the highway jingles you see on the highways leading up to Kashmir. Parts of it are set in an alternative Kashmir. A lot of the language is very, very Indian English slang. And I think that effectively encapsulates a certain kind of hybridity that we've all grown up with.
One small interjection here. I think Rushdie has also fetishized that language a little bit. What do you think?
In Harun, I'm not so sure.
Not in Harun.
In other novels, maybe a bit. But at least in that novel, it felt very...
It's very pure.
Yeah. So all of us have grown up in the shadow of that colonial history where the access to the books, has been of a certain kind. So on the one hand, we have that influence that really shapes us. And on the other hand, all of us grow up with Ramayana and Mahabharata references just as part of the background atmosphere. It just seeps in by osmosis. Whether we actually engage with the epics or not, it's all there in our culture, in a very sort of Edward Saidin sense. And this is actually something that Teju Cole said very beautifully when he was writing an essay on James Baldwin, when he said that as a black person, when he looks at the cathedral at Chartres or at Royam or in Europe, or a Beethoven symphony, it is both his and not his, but he's not going to disclaim it. So you are shaped by that. Its history may have been violent, but now we are shaped by that, and also by what we grew up around. And I think that one thing for me that marks out Indian SF is that you see that hybridity very clearly. You see influences just like a portmanteau from all over the place. Just to add one book more forthcoming, Prashant Srivasta's Spice Cake next year is entirely based on sort of spice trade, and it is also distinctively Indian, but not completely another different take on secondary world India.
Yeah.
So I would.
Or for example, one book that's not mentioned a lot and which is very underrated, The Black Dwarfs of...
Good Little Bay.
Yeah?
Right.
Black Dwarfs of the Good Little Bay.
Good Little Bay, right? It's set in a...
Future Bombay.
Future Bombay.
Who's that by?
Varun
Matthew.
Varun Thomas Matthew.
Right?
Yeah.
Varun Thomas Matthew. Yeah.
I think.
Right? Varun Matthew. And it's set in a future Bombay where this last IAS person is trying to make sense of the world. And it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Then on the other hand, you have Shawan Chaudhary's Competent Authority.
Oh my God.
Shawan Chaudhary's Competent Authority, which is again...
You wouldn't
set
think
in the-
of it as speculative fiction, typically, but
because
it is
it's
so
just
much.
cloaked in satire.
Satire. Yeah.
Right? See, that the beauty of this genre is that it plays off in multiple ways.
And a complete contrast of both these books. Then you've even got Samit Basu's Turbulence Resistance, and there's superheroes running around, And
I like that line. I mean, when I first read it,
And
when
much
it came
before
out,
Miss Marvel came along, right?
Yeah, I mean, when it came out in 2012, by that time I read Simokin, I was a huge Samit Basu fan, and I read a line in that which says, Superman was real and he was Indian.
yeah.
It really resonated. So basically, Turbulence is about this bunch of people who get into a flight in London. They come across turbulence. By the time they land in India, everyone has superpowers.
Yeah.
And I loved that line.
And
As
so,
an Indian, imagine.
can you imagine the ownership you suddenly feel?
Like Superman was real and he was Indian.
Yeah, and that's what's actually extraordinary about this. Just all of these books cover the spectrum from being critical and dealing with very weighty issues to being just fun, because we can occupy all of these spaces.
Like alternate history, have we explored alternate history that much? I'm personally a huge fan of alt history novels because the whole what if-ness of it. If this particular event had not taken place, like World War II being a huge alt history point for writers and TV shows and everything across the world, right? From Man in the High Castle to all of it. Suppose like I ask all three of you to sort of imagine a jumping off point to write like an alternate history of India. What would it be?
There are many very obvious ones. 1857 is sort of the most obvious one.
1857, I was just thinking.
Of course, 47 is one common one. The one I would pick would be actually around 1905, when in the same house in London was born both the future Communist Party and the future RSS, because both Savarkar and Chattopadhyay were in the same house at the same time, and both were plotting together to overthrow the British. One of them went on to become one of the founders of the communist movement in India, and one of them, of course, became the RSS founder. So that historical moment where in the same house was born, both the RSS and Indian communism, that would be an interesting jumping off point, what if, yeah.
But what would happen then? Would one die or something?
Maybe they'd come together. I don't know. Like, it's just hard to say, yeah. But
it's an interesting point of history.
There's one too many points. If I say, then you'll ask what happens next. I don't want to get into it. Yeah, but yes, you're right in that alternate India has not been explored. I mean, there's one stray Jayant Narlikar story where the Marathas win the Battle of Panipat and all of those things. But there have been others written by foreigners like Peshawar Lancers and all that. But Indians writing alternate this thing, I would, as a reader, like to read it too.
Lavanya, do you have any thoughts on this?
I would love to jump on board any of these. Hey, do you want to collaborate? But, I think 1947, some of the events and post-independence, especially because I'm so rooted in Bangalore, Hyderabad, and I'm Tamilian, so I have Tamil roots, exploring what if the south of India had not all unified with the greater nation of India, right? Like the Nizam had held out and Hyderabad had stayed a princely state and the Dravidian secessionists had succeeded. What would that play out like? It's just interesting to consider.
Yeah, I think that's that. I mean, there are people who still dream about it, like establishing USDR and everything. But yeah, I mean, I think that would be really interesting. So, when we talk about Indian science fiction today, the themes that are emerging in your own work, and Shenoy, I'm sure you also writing one maybe, like, or should.
No, I do not have the discipline to write. I will not write one.
Okay. But in your readings, what kind of themes do you see sort of emerging?
I've seen broadly three themes that have been both treated well and also terribly. So it's a bit of a pitfall, because they're easy themes. One very common one is our colonial past and its lingering impact into the future. One instance that does it very well is Tashan Mehta's The Liar's Reef, in which you have good references to the Criminal Tribes Act. It's set in colonial Bombay, and there's this beautiful little almost throwaway line where they're going in a forest, and there's just a one page of Phule's Gulamgiri hanging from like a tree. So it's just like a fantastic image. So that's a book that does it well. But it's just the easy one, right? Like, we were colonized, we are independent, it's part of our heritage, and it's just easy to speculate around that. The second and also very common one is the social cleavages. I see it a lot around the economic cleavages, tech, of course. I don't see it as much when it comes to treatments of caste. And that is probably because the location of us writers is upper caste. So that's probably like a big blind spot there. But other forms of social cleavages, you see it a lot being treated quite a bit. And the third theme is climate change. So Varun Matthews' book, very good job. And in a lot of short stories are around the theme of climate change and its impact. So I see these three themes as being fairly
explored.
It's a bit like Chinese science fiction has a set of themes. So I think that over time, these are emerging as themes in Indian science fiction.
I think a preoccupation with the future and our concerns for the future is a very dominant theme that emerges through a lot of science fiction, short stories, novels, whether it's climate change, the future of what, our social disparities, the impact that could have in the future, and of course our past, which has been visited. Has it been visited enough? Can it be visited more? Absolutely. These, I think, are the dominant important themes if you look at it. And then, of course, there are a lot of playful themes that are just being addressed. Sheer fantasy. And that's exciting.
What do you think about gender? I do see in short stories, at least, like gender being addressed.
Gender, I feel,
By female writers.
by female
mainly.
writers. I think, being a woman writer myself, existing and reflecting your worldview within the constraints of the world you're building through a woman's lens, that in itself holds weight as
Absolutely.
an artifact, right? Because it will not reflect necessarily the views of a male writer doing it unless they are consciously putting themselves in the shoes of a woman experiencing
for
the
example,
world. Yeah.
So, for example, there's this anthology called Magical Women, edited by Sukanya Venkatragan. It's an all-woman anthology and one non-binary person. And all of those stories tackle the exact same thing that we were talking about gender, how much is feminine, how much is not, what is the power of the divine, and takes on Indian myth and futures and all of those things. And it tackles it quite well. But to get back to the themes that you were talking about, the assumption is that science fiction is always about the future, but it's actually not. It's a projection of current fears, aspirations, etc. Which is why if you see the US during the Cold War and all that whole techno-optimism space age, you had these huge space operas and all of those. They were set in the future, but they were reflecting the aspirations and dreams of the writers writing at that point in time. And then you had the new wave and all of those things where inequalities got heightened that much more. And then came the cyberpunks. It was all set in the future, but they were talking about what they were talking about was the present. So what are our current fears? Climate change, economic inequalities. That's what's coming out in the stories that are being written, be it in analog virtual, where you have the virtuals, quote unquote, meritocracy, who have access to all this technology as long as they conform. And then you have the analogs who don't even have running water. Samit Basu's chosen spirits, the powers that be versus the non-conformists, what happens to them, that's handled well. I mean, it's set 10 years into the future. But like I said, it could happen day after tomorrow. Yeah. If you take Prayag Akbar's Layla, for example, that clearly talks about class structures and the role of women and what's happening. And it plays out even in films, right? Indian SF is not restricted to books itself. Like if you see a film like Matrubhumi, female feticide, female infanticide, taken to the extreme. Those are hard of hearing need a dhamaka to hear. So it's just like taking it to the extremes. And it's happening in the future. But what is it really addressing? Today's concerns. And that's all the concerns, be it climate change or be it inequalities, hierarchies, power structures, our concerns. That's what's coming out.
There are certain sort of class structures in India which only science fiction can handle them, because the minute you put that in sort of realistic fiction, you cannot exploit the absurdity of it as much as you can. I think that's what science fiction does, is lets you imagine the absurdity and take it to a certain logical conclusion.
What it can do is it can change one thing about the world and then say what if.
Yeah,
and that
exactly.
is, I think, the power of science fiction is in that. That is what gives their imaginative scope to actually, as Ursula Le Guin said in words that are now both much quoted and much sort of, I think, abused as well, that the task is to imagine alternatives. Right. And in that way, science fiction gives you that canvas on which you can imagine those alternatives.
And also to chime in, because Ursula Le Guin, the what if, right? Like all science fiction is a what if, which she also says. And viewing it as a sandbox where you can keep a whole bunch of parameters the same, shift one and see, okay, now how does this play out? How does this impact the people who live in this world? And you can actually do it with a lot more nuance without being trapped by all of the contextual baggage that you will have to contend with. And also, I think, given the world that we live in, it is a wonderful space in which one can be subversive and criticize pretty heavily.
What if is one thing, but there's the other framing as well, which is, if this goes on, what then? That's the other thing. So what if will lead you to alternatives?
Yeah, the logical conclusion of this.
Yeah, I mean, how is it going to play out 10 years into the thing? So it's not really a what if or an alternative.
There is a story in, say, like cows coming into BIC or something like that. I mean, the logical conclusion of not, banning sort of.
Correct. If this goes on, what happens?
That's actually like not far-fetched at all, I feel. I wanted to ask all of you also, are there any themes that you feel are not being addressed, or like, stuff that you would like to see being addressed?
I'd love to see Indian like space opera.
Right,
First
absolutely.
Contact. All these things that, are just those really, really huge themes themes that presently writers like Adrian Tchaikovsky and Alistair Reynolds do so well. I just love to see, and I don't mean like Mahabharata in space, like not that kind of stuff, but actually, no reference, none whatsoever. But yeah, tackling those kinds of themes so something like Arkady Martin's recent a memory called Empire and Desolation called Peace. Right, so books of that kind, I think we'll see them soon, but we still have to get to the point where I think we feel confident on that canvas, that scope, that scale. Yeah.
It's a bit of an echo, inclusive of space opera and of course fantasy. I would love to see science fiction and fantasy that does not necessarily have to problematize the experiences of being Indian very overtly, where it can just be entertainment and exist as entertainment for its own sake, without having to justify the Indianness or using Indianness as a hook to justify its existence. I do, of course, agree that identity forms a huge part of how we write these stories. But does it need to be overtly flagged in these stories beyond maybe names or, I guess, cultural footnotes, the way The Wall does them and The Horizon does them, or even going back to Rushdie and some of Samit's work, Samit Basu's work. I would actually love to see the world open up to being able to read a book written by an Indian that does not signal, here is something that could only happen in my country or in my culture.
That's something I don't know which black author it was.
Was it Tochi?
No,
there was a lovely essay.
Why is the luxury of creating a secondary world, like for example, you take Asimov's Foundation or whatever, just to give a very famous example or something like that, which is not rooted in my country or my culture. Luxury afforded only to Western white authors.
Exactly.
Why is that a luxury afforded only to Western white authors? Why can't an Indian write it?
Absolutely.
Why can't an Indian write it?
Yeah. Without being accused of, I don't know, being deracinated or something.
I think it's less about deracination acquisitions and more that you wouldn't be able to get through publishing.
Like where is your Indianness?
Like I said, it's not Indian enough. Like I said, it's not Indian enough.
Yeah.
So
how can they put, like on the book cover, they have to have some smoke and like Islamic architecture and stuff, right?
Or sari or something like that.
Sari, bindi, the works. I'm glad about the place that Indian SF is in right now.
Yeah.
Just to give you an example, there's this book by Ian MacDonald called River of Gods.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. Okay, so he came, immersed himself, it was not fetishization or anything of that sort. So it's set in 2047. 2047. Time is like the eve of India's 100th birthday, so to speak. And India has been sort of balkanized, the state of Bengal is towing icebergs to this thing. Then there are Blade Runner style Krishna cops, and it was nice. And one thing hasn't changed. Indians are still watching soap opera, right? The state of Bharat is at war with Awadh and all of those things. And when it come to BLF, and I asked him, like, if you had to write River of God now, right? Because that was written in 2004. 2004. If you had to write it now, what would you change? He said, I wouldn't write it. Because there are far better Indian writers who are there now who could write a story like that much better than I could. I wouldn't.
Anil Menon's half of what I say comes close to that kind of a plot, actually.
Yes. So I wouldn't write it. I'm glad all these guys are out there writing these great stories so that, we get to tell our own stories.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to move away from Indianness now, come back to it later. One thing that, as a watcher and reader of science fiction, I've been realizing that I'm tired of dystopia now to a certain extent. And this whole very male dystopia view, I was reading this Atlantic article, which actually, this is not the pandemic you imagined, right? Actually, the world didn't burst into flames, or there wasn't as much violence as there, people would have imagined. But apocalyptic novels always imagine very violent worlds instead of, cooperation or, whatever. Why do dystopias overwhelmingly form such a huge part of science fiction and SFF writing?
I'll say that there's a great essay by Cory Doctorow in The New Yorker where he critiques exactly this, which I would recommend to everyone. It's very good. And my second thing is that I recently initiated a call for a science fiction reading group in Delhi. And one of the questions I asked in the Google form was, what kind of science fiction would you like to read when we get together? And honestly, the majority were dystopia. And it was surprising to me. And I think that there's always held that lure. There's this sense of nihilism. There is a certain kind of attractiveness to it. A sense of destruction is always there. And good dystopian writing is very good. I mean, it really is very powerful. I think that at the same time, there are limits to it and it's sort of exhausted itself in many ways. So one response to dystopia is something called hopepunk, presently doing the rounds in Western sort of science fiction lingo, which is, like hope, optimism, it'll all turn out well.
Like Becky Chambers?
Yeah, I was just going to come to Becky Chambers, right? So Becky Chambers' work, the most recent is called The Monk and the Robot series. And it's set in this sort of moon, which does what is technically called half-Earth socialism, where basically like you live on exactly half the Earth and the other half is for wilderness. And the two are integrated. So as you go through wilderness to get in between different habitations, but at no point can you live on more than half the volume of the surface. It's a theory called half-Earth socialism, and she takes that and does it into she's very popular. But I still find that very limiting because we are not told how you got there. And it's a world shorn of conflict, except for inner conflict. And again, I think that that's too easy. And I think that, again, something that I think does it very well, again, going back to Le Guin, the dispossessed is she calls it an ambiguous utopia, right? So an ambiguous utopia where you see the kernel of utopia, but not a utopia that is easy or shorn of that kind of conflict. And I think in her line, you have like many writers have come after her. So again, Adrian Tchaikovsky's work is a good example. The Doors of Eden, which we both loved, is a great book, and that is neither dystopic nor utopian, but it has in it the seeds of a possible utopia.
It circles back to what Shenoy was saying earlier, which is, if this goes on, what then? I think that is a very fundamental preoccupation that leads to a lot of dystopia, because if we look at India and, of course, the wider world, a lot of things that we see occurring could lead to very drastic consequences. They exist with drastic consequences as it is today. In many ways, some work of science fiction is concerned with what's happening today and wants to kind of project that into its extreme to kind of send that message home. I think that forms a huge part of why dystopia. And also, if you really look at dystopia, it is dystopia for the people who are attempting to overthrow the world that they are living in, but it is somebody's utopia over there, right? There is a power structure to whom it is utopic. And I feel like a function of dystopia is to criticize that power structure and to critique it, because a lot of the time, ideas that are presented as, if only this happened, it would save the world. They're really high level. And one act of critiquing them and kind of exploring them is to follow them to a natural conclusion and present, okay, if we don't factor into this big idea, all of these little things, it could go horrifically wrong. Yeah.
I mean, who are you saving the world for?
The question also arises, who is it a dystopia for?
Yeah.
Like, for example, when Margaret Atwood wrote *Handmaid's Tale*, one thing she clearly said is nothing that happens in the book isn't something that's not happened to women across history. Everything that you see in the book has played out in history, and history was her guide in writing *The Handmaid's Tale*. But we call it a dystopia. Like I said, if this goes on, what it happens? A good guide, for example, would be Fahrenheit 451. That's dystopian, right? So when Ray Bradbury was asked, why are you predicting a dystopia, books are burning and all of those things, and all they said, hello, I was not predicting, I was trying to prevent it. So that's where dystopias have a place. If we don't cut off our obsession with television or social media and all of those things, and this whole anti-intellectualism, this is where we will end up. So I was trying to prevent it. This whole outraging, if you don't stop or you don't put a thing, this is the society that we will end up with. So I was trying to warn people with this book. So dystopias do have their space.
Of course they do.
But it's that William Gibson line, right? The future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. And just to complement what Lavanya said, I think one great book that is a classic that actually very starkly shows dystopia for some and utopia for others is Philip K. Dick's The Penultimate Truth. Because there the premise is that you've basically conned most of the world into believing that the surface is completely scarred by nuclear radiation. So they all live underground in the belief that if they step outside, they will die in a painful death. But above ground, it's totally fine. And you have a few people living in huge estates. And so that's dystopia and utopia. I think he does that very well, and he does generally everything very well, but that book's good.
Or in analog virtual, for the conformists, for the virtuals who are conformist and happy because they've been brainwashed in childhood that this is the only right way and this is the way to do. If you ask them, they are living in a utopia.
No, of course. But also from the point of view of the reader, we are asked to identify with the people for whom it is a dystopia, right? So our point of view is of, people living the dystopia. As much as I appreciate that point that it is, of course, utopia for some within the scope of the novel itself. I think we just have time for one more question. So, coming to Brahmastra.
You were just waiting. You were just like waiting, like, okay, when is it going to be the last question? And I'm going to bring that back.
Yeah. In Indian science fiction, in what ways do mythology and speculative fictions collide? Given that mythology is more associated with fantasy in India, right? Like many fantasy novels have used mythology as sort of a jumping off point or borrowed stories from them. And also, like, is there a tendency to somewhat look down upon mythology as not serious enough? Has it acquired this aura of slightly mediocre writing?
That falls under the ambit of what I call mythsploitation. I mean, like low-hanging fruit. Assembly line, you just write, it's like a beach read.
Exactly, right?
Like a beach read. Basically, it means you read it on the beach and leave the book on the beach and go. And then you forget about it. But then there are ways in which Indian myth has been tackled quite well. Like, for example, one example that I go to is this anthology edited by Vandana Singh and Anil Menon called Breaking the Bow. It's an anthology of short stories about characters and incidents in the Ramayana and reimagining them in a speculative way. And it's not just Indians who've written it. You have people like Lavitidar and all of that who've contributed. Like, for example, Lavitidar's story starts with this awesome line, and Brahma said, "Let us defrag." And then you have a story which is told from Shurpanaka's point of view. In the Pramit Das's story, Sita and Rama are AI. There is a nice, good way in which it can be done. Okay, just because it's a jumping off point from myth or something doesn't mean that you can summarily dismiss it as being just another Ramayana remix or, like he said, Mahabharata in space. Because I've read enough of those, and trust me, after a point, it just gets boring. Gender swapped Karna, same thing that plays out happens in space. Instead of bows and arrows, they're fighting with ray guns.
Mahabharata with nuclear weapons, that sort of thing, right? That has been done a lot, I feel. How would you use Indian mythology in your work, or is there scope for you to use it in any way?
Personally, for me, Indian mythology, it's in the background because Gautam said this very early on in this conversation, how we happen to have just imbibed it as a product of living and growing up in India. And certainly it evokes a sense of the epic, it delivers a sense of the epic and an appreciation for the same, but it is very much in the background. I don't believe I would actually actively utilize it, at least not in a straightforward conventional way, like Rama and Sita being AI, that's kind of up my alley. But having said that, I think for me personally, I would engage with Indian mythology retellings that offer a critical perspective on these myths, right? There is a lot in these myths that does not hold relevance in the present day and needs to be criticized. And the trouble is, it is very dicey to criticize that in the climate we live in. It's dangerous territory, especially if you happen to write and live out of India. And so I would not touch that with a 10-foot pole. I mean, my interest personally is in creating the kind of science fiction I was talking about earlier. Does it really need to be entirely Indian? And so that's where I stand.
That's fair enough. Yeah. Absolutely.
So I think to answer the first question, I'd say there are three genres of using Indian myth. One, of course, is a straightforward retelling in English in a way that endorses the social structures that those myths come from. Amish's books, for example, are the best example, and they sell in huge numbers. So I think it's not something that can be dismissed. It has to be taken seriously. And I think it fills a certain need. It fills a need that was created when Mahabharata and Ramayana was serialized, and it fills that need very well. And it is, I think, in some way shaping people, and so I think it's worth engaging with seriously. Whatever you may think of the quality of the writing, it's there, it exists, and it's not going to be whisked away. The second way in which I see it being used is a very shallow kind of progressive retelling, where, like Shenoy said, you gender swap one character, and you're like, oh, I've now retold this in a progressive way. I think ever since Madeline Miller's books became popular, that has become like an industry in its own right. Like you take one character and say, okay, now it's progressive.
Chitra Banerjee did it even earlier with Draupadi.
Yeah. And I think the third one, and this is the one I really like, is that I think it's worth remembering that we have a long tradition of subversive engagement with the myths. So Mahashweta Devi is after Kurukshetra. 3 short stories that examine the aftermath of the Mahabharata from the perspectives of the characters who were completely marginalized, like the women in the House of Lack and all of that. It's brilliant. Dinkar's Rashmi Rathi, is completely castigates the Pandavas so well. It's one of my favorite poems ever. So I think we have a long tradition of that, and let's not also forget that we've had that long and brilliant tradition. As far as how I use it, it's this big well you can just dip into. So, for example, you have the Western story of Icarus. Icarus flies too close to the sun, wings are burnt. In India, you have Jatayu's story, right? It's similar, but I think even more powerful. You know, because somebody's wings are shorn off. They don't die, but like the wings are lost and they can never fly again in Jatayu's story. So I, for example, used that as the Icarus equivalent in the wall. So I think that's something you can just dip into, and I think Indian myth gives you
Absolutely,
that,
or like Karna's chariot wheels sinking
you
into
have all
the
those
mud. And
set pieces, right? Like those brilliant set pieces.
I think another way that people have done it, or it could be done, is also taking characters out of these stories. And I think Krishna, Uday Shankar and all, I mean, somewhat like, they've kind of taken mythologized characters.
Yeah, so for example, in Immortal, she's taken Ashwathama and said, okay, what happened to him? I mean, he's supposed to be immortal, still roaming the world. So what happens to him? What does he undergo? And all that sort of thing. So it's not a retelling. When it comes to myth, you can retell it, or like many people are doing now, you take a character or you shine the focus like Vasudeva Nair did with Bhima, or you can reinterpret it. But I don't know if this can be considered speculative fiction. Just a straight out retelling or a reinterpretation can be considered speculative enough. Whereas when in a secondary world, he brings in the story of Jatayu, so it has a context in a different world. There's something new that's been brought into the story. The context has been reimagined. So that's when it becomes speculative,
Really
which is why I go back to Breaking the Book. Because there, the context is reimagined. How it plays out is reimagined, not just reinterpreted. The motivations are sort of challenged. The technological background is brought in. They're placed in a separate time frame. So unless you have something new which comes in, which gives it that speculative layer, then it just remains in the realm of retelling and reinterpretation.
Thanks so much for being here, and thanks Gautam, Lavanya, and Gautam. It's like
He's the Gautam here. I'm the Shenoy.
you're the Shenoy for this amazing discussion. Thank you.
Thanks for moderating.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for moderating. Thanks for BSc for giving us an opportunity. Thank you all for being such an attentive audience. Thank you.
Thank you for staying on for the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, please share it with family and friends. You can also leave us a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. The crew that makes these podcasts possible are Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghavendra Tenkaila. Artwork and design is by Chandani Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studios. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org. Do follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter to get regular updates on our programming. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.